Did you know that the story of Hagar and Ishmael in the desert reveals a powerful lesson about overcoming and faith in the midst of difficulties? In this video, we will explore how this ancient narrative brings essential teachings for our lives today. So, if you want to learn how to trust God even in the darkest moments, subscribe to the channel and keep watching to discover this transformative message. The story of Ishmael, told in the Old Testament, is a rich and meaningful narrative that addresses themes such as the conflict of promises and divine mercy. Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, was born of Hagar, Sarah's Egyptian servant. Although he was not the son of the promise made by God to Abraham and Sarah, Ishmael received a divine blessing, being destined to become the father of a great nation. In this video, we will explore Ishmael's journey from his birth and the challenges he faced until the fulfillment of God's promise to multiply his descendants. Join us on this journey through the scriptures to understand how the story of Ishmael reveals God's faithfulness and care for all of his creatures. Ishmael's origin is deeply connected to the promises made by God to Abraham, the patriarch of faith, who was called to be the father of a great nation. Abraham, whose original name was Abram, lived in Ur of the Chaldees, a region that corresponds to modern-day Iraq. When God called him to leave his land and go to a place that he would show him, God promised to make him a great nation, to make his name great, and to bless all the families of the earth through him. This divine promise marks the beginning of the narrative of Ishmael. Despite their faith, Abraham and Sarah face a situation that seemed to contradict this promise. Sarah was barren, and years passed without the couple having a child, making the situation increasingly desperate. As time went by, doubts and uncertainties began to arise. In the chapters of the book of Genesis, God's call to Abraham to leave his homeland and family is recounted, with the promise that he would become a great nation and a blessing to all. Even so, the absence of an heir became a central concern for the couple. Abraham began to question how the promise would be fulfilled without a son. He expressed his concerns to God, mentioning that the manager of his house, a servant named Eliezer of Damascus, would be his heir, since he had no direct descendants. However, God reaffirmed the promise, ensuring that Abraham would have a son of his own blood. Still, time continued to pass and the promise did not come true, testing Abraham's faith and leading him, along with Sarah, to seek human solutions to what seemed impossible. If you are connecting with this powerful story and want to explore more inspiring lessons like this, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. That way, you won't miss any updates and can be part of our community that seeks to understand and live faith in a profound way. Now, let's go back to the story. God's promise to Abraham was not limited to his personal life, but had implications for all humanity. From Abraham, a great nation would arise, the people of Israel, through whom all nations would be blessed. However, the lack of a direct heir seemed to compromise this promise. After years of waiting and facing the apparent impossibility of having a child, Sarah, Abraham's wife, made a decision that would change the course of history. Desperate about her infertility and feeling responsible for the lack of an heir, Sarah suggested that Abraham have a child with her Egyptian servant, Hagar. This proposal, although legally accepted in the culture of the time, where an infertile wife could turn to a servant to have children in her place, was full of emotional and spiritual implications. By proposing this, Sarah revealed her internal conflict between faith in the divine promise and the pressure of circumstances. In the biblical account, Sarah, unable to conceive, suggested that Abraham marry Hagar in the hope that she could bear a son. Abraham agreed, and Hagar became pregnant. Hagar's conception quickly changed the family dynamic, and upon realizing that she was pregnant, Hagar began to despise her mistress Sarah. This situation brought new challenges and conflicts, highlighting the dilemmas and trials faced by Abraham's family. Hagar's reaction sparked a serious conflict between the two women, something that Sarah had not anticipated, resulting in a climate of tension and hostility in Abraham's household. The book of Genesis recounts how Hagar, upon realizing that she was pregnant, began to look down on her mistress. In light of this, Sarah expressed her frustration to Abraham, saying that after giving her servant to him as a wife, she had been treated with contempt by Hagar. She then asked God to judge the situation between them. Sarah, who had initially and suggested the solution, now feels hurt and betrayed, and the situation becomes untenable, placing Abraham in the middle of the conflict. In an attempt to resolve the dispute, Abraham tells Sarah that she can deal with Hagar as she sees fit. This leads Sarah to treat Hagar harshly. The birth of Ishmael occurs in a context marked by impatience, doubt, and disputes. Sarah's decision to give Hagar to Abraham not only complicated the situation, but also generated family tension that would have lasting consequences. This part of the story highlights how human decisions driven by desperation and lack of faith can lead to complex and difficult-to-manage consequences. The conflict between Sarah and Hagar also illustrates the emotional and relational complications that arise when trying to fulfill divine promises through human efforts instead of waiting for God's right time. Sarah's attitude is understandable from a human point of view and reflects the difficulty of fully trusting divine promises when circumstances seem to contradict what was promised. Ishmael, in turn, is born into an environment of conflict and tension as a result of both Sarah's desperation and a partial fulfillment of God's promise to Abraham to give him a son. This passage invites us to reflect on our own reactions to challenging situations. When we feel that God's promises are not being fulfilled in our lives, it is easy, like Sarah, to want to take control and seek human solutions to issues that require divine intervention. This story, however, reminds us of the importance of trusting in God's timing and avoiding making hasty decisions out of impatience or fear. The birth of Ishmael shows us that, although God is faithful to his promises, human ways cannot replace divine action. The conflict between Sarah and Hagar teaches us about the consequences of not waiting on God, showing how solutions that arise from a lack of faith can significantly complicate our lives and relationships. After Ishmael's conception, the dynamics in Abraham's household changed drastically. The tension between Sarah and Hagar, which began when Hagar discovered her pregnancy, intensifies. Hagar's disdain for Sarah creates a conflict that affects the entire family. This disagreement is not only a reflection of the rivalry between the two women, but also a consequence of decisions made without seeking divine guidance. Hagar's disdain for Sarah becomes a deep source of hurt and resentment for Sarah. Although it was her idea for Abraham to take Hagar as his wife in order to have a child, the outcome is completely different from what she imagined. The relationship between the two women deteriorates quickly, and Sarah feels betrayed and hurt, made worse by the fact that Hagar, being a servant, now considers herself superior because she is pregnant. Abraham, in turn, finds himself in a difficult position. He had agreed to Sarah's plan, but now he sees how this decision has created deep conflicts in his home. Instead of mediating the dispute, he allows Sarah to resolve the problem as she sees fit, an attitude that could be seen as a lack of leadership at a critical moment, allowing the situation to escalate even further. Sarah, in her grief and resentment, treats Hagar harshly, which leads Hagar to flee into the desert. The conflict between the two women reveals not only personal and emotional tensions, but also the complexities of human relationships when decisions are made without seeking divine guidance. The rivalry between Sarah and Hagar arises in a context of power, unfulfilled expectations, and changing status. As Abraham's legitimate wife, Sarah expected her position of authority in the family to remain unchanged, even after Hagar's conception. However, Hagar's pregnancy changes the balance of power, generating competition and rivalry, something that Sarah had not anticipated. Hagar, who was a servant without rights in the patriarchal society of that time, finds her position temporarily elevated by being pregnant. This change in her social status, even if temporary, causes her to feel superior to Sarah, who remains childless. However, Hagar's new attitude toward her mistress triggers a cycle of suffering for both of them. Sarah's harsh treatment is a response to her own vulnerability and the hurt caused by Hagar's contempt, revealing how pain and resentment can lead people to adopt behaviors that increase conflict rather than resolve it. Rather than seeking a solution through reconciliation or prayer, Sarah opts for an attitude of retaliation, which leads to the temporary breakdown of the relationship between the two women. Hagar, faced with Sarah's mistreatment and harshness, decides to flee into the desert. This act of escape is significant because it reflects the desperation and sense of loneliness that Hagar experiences. By fleeing, she places herself in a situation of vulnerability, facing the danger of loneliness and uncertainty about the future in a hostile environment. The tension between Sarah and Hagar offers us several important lessons about human relationships and the need to seek God's guidance in our decisions. First, it shows how our choices, especially when made without consulting God's will, can result in unexpected and often painful consequences. Sarah's decision to offer Hagar to Abraham, despite having been made with good intentions, ended up generating a conflict that brought suffering to all involved. In addition, the narrative reflects how pain and insecurity can lead us to treat others harshly and to act in ways that do not demonstrate God's love and grace. Hagar, in turn, motivated by resentment and pain, not only made the situation worse, but also highlighted how a lack of forgiveness and reconciliation can poison relationships. Her escape into the desert symbolizes the feelings of isolation and despair that many face in situations of conflict and abuse. After escaping Sarah's mistreatment, Hagar, now pregnant, finds herself alone and unprotected in the desert. Her condition is desperate, without resources or guidance in a hostile place. In Genesis, it is narrated that the angel of the Lord found Hagar by a spring of water in the desert, near the road to Shur, and asked her, "Where have you come from, and where are you going?" Hagar replied, "I am running away from my mistress Sarai." The angel of the Lord, often described in Scripture as a direct manifestation of the divine presence, finds Hagar by a spring of water in the desert. This encounter is not accidental, but rather a divine intervention in a time of great need. The question posed by the angel, asking where Hagar came from and where she was going, was not just seeking information, but prompting her to reflect on her situation. These questions invite her to examine her past and think about the future, confronting the reality of her current condition. Hagar's response, explaining that she was running away from her mistress Sarah, revealed her fear and desperation. She was escaping suffering, but she found herself without a clear direction, in a place of extreme vulnerability. In this context, God intervened with a promise and an instruction. As recounted in Genesis, the angel of the Lord told her to return to her mistress and submit to her authority. Although this command seemed harsh, especially considering the treatment Hagar had received, it was accompanied by an important promise. God assured Hagar that her descendants would be so numerous that they could not be counted. This promise echoed the one God had made to Abraham, demonstrating that the Lord had a plan and a purpose for Hagar and for the son she was carrying, Ishmael, even in the midst of difficult circumstances. The encounter continued with a prophecy about Ishmael's character and destiny. The angel announced that Hagar would give birth to a son and that she should name him Ishmael, for the Lord had heard her affliction. The name Ishmael means God hears, serving as a constant reminder that the Lord had noticed Hagar's suffering and responded to her cry. The description of Ishmael as a man of indomitable spirit, whose hands would be in conflict with everyone and who would live in conflict with his brothers, foreshadows the challenges he and his descendants would face. But the most significant aspect is that God was involved in Ishmael's life from his conception and, even in the face of adversity, had a purpose for him. This encounter in the wilderness highlights God's deep compassion for those who are marginalized and oppressed. Hagar, a pregnant foreign servant abandoned in the wilderness, is seen and heard by God in a time and context in which women, especially servants, had little social value. The Lord demonstrates that every person is valuable in his eyes. The wilderness, often associated with loneliness and danger in Scripture, becomes for Hagar a place of revelation and hope. It is in this hostile environment that God reveals himself to her, not only as a God of promises made to the mighty like Abraham, but also as the one who cares deeply for those in need. The command to return to Sarah may seem contradictory, but it reflects a call to trust in God's plans and timing. Although returning to a difficult situation is not easy, God promises to be with Hagar and to care for her and her son. The promise of a large offspring for Ishmael indicates that God not only sees the current situation, but also has a plan for the future. The name Ishmael, God hears, is a testament to God's character, recalling not only Hagar's past suffering, but also promising that the Lord will continue to listen and answer, even in the midst of adversity. Hagar's experience with the angel teaches us that even in our darkest and loneliest moments, God sees and hears us. Hagar, fleeing in the wilderness, probably felt she was abandoned and without hope, but the Lord found her and gave her a promise of life and a future. This story challenges us to trust that God is present in our lives, even when we feel lost or helpless. It reminds us that the Lord cares not only for great leaders or those who seem to have everything under control, but also for those who are marginalized, hurting, and desperate. Hagar's journey is a powerful image of God's grace and compassion for everyone, regardless of their position or social status. If you are connecting with this powerful story and want to explore more inspiring lessons like this, be sure to subscribe to our channel. That way, you won't miss any updates and you can be part of our community that seeks to understand and live faith in a deeper way. Now, back to the story. God's command for Hagar to return and submit to her mistress may seem difficult, but it teaches us that sometimes He calls us to face challenging situations with confidence that He is at work in the midst of our circumstances. The fact that the Lord gave Ishmael a name even before he was born demonstrates that God has a purpose for our lives since before we came into the world. After returning to Abraham's house, strengthened by the divine promise, Hagar gives birth to her son Ishmael. This event is significant for both her and Abraham, since Ishmael is the patriarch's first son, although he is not the one promised by God through Sarah. The birth of Ishmael represents a partial fulfillment of Abraham's desire for descendants, but it also introduces complexities into family relationships. As recorded in Genesis, Hagar bore Abraham a son, and Abraham named him Ishmael. At this time, Abraham was 80 years old. The birth of Ishmael not only brings joy to Hagar, but also reaffirms the word that the angel gave her in the wilderness. Ishmael serves as a continual reminder that God hears and sees those who suffer, just as He did for Hagar in her time of anguish. However, the birth of Ishmael is a result of decisions made by Abraham and Sarah that did not align with God's original promise, and these choices had consequences that would impact the entire family. As Ishmael grew, tensions between Sarah and Hagar continued. Although Hagar returned to Abraham's home and gave birth to a son, her relationship with Sarah remained strained. Ishmael's presence, while a blessing to Hagar, was a constant reminder to Sarah of her infertility and the rash decision she had made in offering Hagar as a surrogate mother. This birth occurs amid divine promises, but it also reflects human decisions that attempted to help fulfill those promises. Desperate for a child, Abraham and Sarah decided to find a solution on their own, which resulted in the birth of Ishmael. Although God blessed Ishmael and promised that he would be the father of a great nation, he was not the fulfillment of the promise of an heir to Abraham through Sarah. The decision to act on their own brought lasting complications to the family, introducing new tensions. Sarah, even knowing that Ishmael was Abraham's son, could not avoid feelings of jealousy and resentment, which added more difficulties to the family dynamic. Ishmael's name, which means God hears, is significant as it reflects God's character as someone who listens to prayers and perceives the afflictions of His people. However, Ishmael also symbolizes the consequences of trying to carry out God's plans with human means. Through Ishmael, God shows that, although He can bless and use our failures, there is a better way that involves fully trusting in His promises. The birth of Ishmael makes us reflect on the impact of our choices, especially when we try to control circumstances instead of trusting in God's timing and methods. In their impatience, Abraham and Sarah sought a solution to their childlessness that, although it seemed to solve the problem, brought new complications. This story challenges us to evaluate our reactions when God's promises seem to be slow to come to fruition. Sometimes, out of impatience or desperation, we may try to help the Lord by making well-intentioned decisions that are out of alignment with His will. The result, as in the case of Ishmael, can be a blessing, but it can also create challenges that could have been avoided if we had waited on the Lord. The story of Ishmael also speaks of God's mercy. Although he was not the promised son, the Lord did not abandon him, but gave him a name that reflects his compassionate character and promised that he would become the father of a great nation. This reminds us that even when we stray from God's perfect plans, He remains faithful and can redeem any situation. With the birth of Ishmael, the tensions in Abraham's household escalate, but God does not forget His original promise. Although Ishmael is blessed and assured of a large number of descendants, the divine plan continues with the arrival of another son, Isaac. This part of the narrative highlights God's sovereignty and His ability to fulfill His promises despite human actions. In Genesis, God reaffirms His covenant with Abraham and clarifies that it is through Isaac, not Ishmael, that the promise will be fulfilled. He assures Sarah that she will give birth to a son and will name him Isaac, with whom the covenant will be established as an everlasting pact. As for Ishmael, God promises that he too will be blessed, will father 12 princes, and will become a great nation. However, the line of the covenant that will bring blessing to all nations will be through Isaac. This story teaches us that God's ways do not follow human logic, but are elevated and sovereign. Abraham loved Ishmael and wanted the best for him, but God had a specific plan that included Isaac as the heir of the promise. This reminds us that although God hears our prayers, His answers always align with His perfect will. The confirmation of the covenant with Isaac occurs in a context of promises and expectations. Abraham, upon receiving the promise of a son with Sarah, had to wait years for its fulfillment. In his desperation, he decided to act with Sarah, which produced Ishmael. However, God did not forget His original promise and reaffirmed His faithfulness by confirming it through Isaac. This account invites us to trust that God's plans are carried out in His own time and on His terms. We learn that although our decisions may have complex consequences, the Lord is merciful and capable of transforming any situation. The birth of Ishmael, the fruit of an imperfect decision, is blessed by God, showing that even when we stray from His perfect plan, He can use our failures to fulfill His purposes. Finally, the arrival of Isaac changes the family dynamic. Although Abraham loved Hagar's son Ishmael, the birth of Isaac introduces new tensions. Sarah, Isaac's mother, begins to worry about Ishmael's position in the family. The decision to expel Hagar and Ishmael from Abraham's home was motivated by concerns about Ishmael's position in the family and the possible division of the inheritance with Isaac. This resulted in a difficult and painful time for Abraham, especially after Isaac's weaning, which was marked by a great feast. During this celebration, Sarah observed Ishmael, who was then about 14 years old, mocking Isaac. Although the text does not detail the nature of the mockery, it was enough to arouse deep fear in Sarah, who came to see Ishmael as a threat to her son's inheritance. Thus, she demanded that Abraham send Hagar and Ishmael away. Abraham, distressed by the thought of being separated from his son, had to deal with this painful decision. However, God intervened, assuring him that He would grant Sarah's request and promising to care for Ishmael and Hagar. Divine intervention is described as God assuring him that, although Isaac was the heir of the promise, Ishmael would also be blessed and would become the founder of a great nation. With this assurance, Abraham decided to send Hagar and Ishmael into the wilderness. Abraham rose early, provided bread and a vessel of water for Hagar, and said goodbye, deeply moved. Departing into the wilderness with such limited resources conveyed an image of sadness and tragedy, even though Abraham trusted in God's promise. The desolate environment to which they were sent represented both danger and a test of faith, suggesting that, although they faced an uncertain future, they were still under God's care. When the water ran out, Hagar was overcome with despair. Unable to bear the sight of Ishmael dying, she placed him under a bush and walked away so as not to see him perish. In this moment of distress, she wept, and her cry of anguish was heard by God. The angel of the Lord appeared to Hagar and reassured her, assuring her that God had heard the boy's voice and renewing the promise that he would become a great nation. God then opened Hagar's eyes, and she saw a spring of water, which saved their lives. This miracle demonstrated God's constant care, even in the darkest moments, allowing Hagar and Ishmael to continue on their journey. Their encounter with God in the desert showed that, although they seemed abandoned to their fate, they were being protected and guided by a higher power. The story of Hagar and Ishmael reveals profound lessons about God's faithfulness. God not only cared for his chosen people, but also extended his compassion to all, regardless of their background. God's act of opening Hagar's eyes to the source of water reminds us that, often, the solution to our problems is already close at hand, but we need to see clearly to find it. The desert, symbolizing D. Hardships and trials became a place of renewal and hope for Hagar and Ishmael, showing that God transformed situations of apparent despair into opportunities to demonstrate his grace. Even though Ishmael was not the son of the promise, he was loved and blessed by God, emphasizing that divine mercy reaches everyone, without distinction. This narrative teaches us to trust in God's providence, knowing that he is in control and can redeem even the most difficult circumstances. Ishmael's name, which means God hears, reinforces that God responds to the cries of those in need, providing relief and direction in times of adversity. Finally, Hagar and Ishmael's experience in the desert challenges us to maintain faith, even when we feel lost. We must believe that God provides what is necessary, even in the most adverse situations, and be attentive to the blessings, sometimes hidden, that he places in our path. This story inspires us to seek divine presence with confidence, sharing our experiences to encourage others who are also facing difficult times. Therefore, when we face challenges in life, let us remember that God never abandons us and is always attentive to our needs. As Christians, we are called to live this trust, spreading the message of God's love and faithfulness to everyone around us. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like. Contribute to our growth. Stay in peace.